afternoon. You're watching the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Pence on a Middle East mission. Putin plants a foot in Iraq. New Russian air bases shared with Iran in Syria. Turkish air and ground assault on Syrian Kurds. Abbas's strategy tanks. Debka File reports that U.S. Vice President Mike Pence arrived in Jerusalem on Sunday after visiting Cairo and Amman, where he met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and Jordan's King Abdullah. In Egypt, Pence had positive words to say to the Egyptian president.
We stand shoulder to shoulder with you in Egypt in the fight against terrorism. Our hearts grieve as Americans for the loss of life to terrorist attacks that have taken place against Coptic Christian community here in the last year, and of course the horrific attack on a mosque this last November that claimed the lives of more than 300 innocent men, women, and children. We resolve to continue to stand with Egypt in the battle against terrorism, and Mr. President, we're grateful for your leadership in that cause.
While in Jordan, Pence was met by protesters who claimed they rejected U.S. policies.
We refused the Pence visit, and we totally refuse it, and we asked the government to not to welcome him and not to accept his visit, especially after the protests the people has been doing for more than 40 days here. But
Debka sources tell us that Pence had an even harsher message as well. He informed el-Sisi and King Abdullah that they would need to be on board with Trump's Middle East plan if they wish to continue benefiting from U.S. economic and military aid. He asked the two leaders to send a message to Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas that if he continued to insult Trump through verbal attacks, Trump could slash more funds to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees. He also stated that Washington would block any access to funding from international institutions. Abbas, who is in Brussels meeting with European officials, has stated that Pence is not welcome in Ramallah. The administration is holding over their heads the prospect of a reassessment of the relationship. This amounts to a total and indefinite freeze on all ties. Pence had this to say following his meeting in Egypt and Jordan.
My message to each of them is that we are partners, we are strategic partners, that nothing has changed, and that we are absolutely committed to building a partnership for security, confronting terrorism together, but also finding ways that we can advance the peace process. And I hope that my message here with President el-Sisi and in Jordan tomorrow and in Israel will make it clear that while the American people and the American president have stated that we recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, that we are ready now to move forward to resolve long-standing issues and finally bring this decades-old conflict to an end.
In Israel, Pence spoke at the Knesset, where he discussed Trump's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. He also discussed the reduction of funds to the UNRWA. Pence was greeted in Jerusalem by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who welcomed him to the State of Israel.
הערב יגיע לישראל ידיד גדול של מדינת ישראל, ידיד אמת, סגן נשיא ארצות הברית מייק פנס. אנחנו נקבל את פניו בברכה, אני מצפה מאוד לשיחותינו. אנחנו נדון במאמצי ממשל טראמפ לבלום את התוקפנות האיראנית, את תוכנית הגרעין האיראנית, וכמובן לקדם את הביטחון והשלום באזור. מי שבאמת שואף להגשים את המטרות האלה, יודע שאין תחליף למנהיגותה והובלתה של ארצות הברית. אני רואה זאת כחרפה שחברי כנסת מתכוונים להחרים את הביקור החשוב הזה בכנסת, אפילו מבקשים להפריע לו. אנחנו כולנו נהיה שם ונחלוק סגן הנשיא פנס את הכבוד הגדול הראוי לו.
Two Russian countermoves have opposed the U.S. steps in Syria. Russia has reached into Iraq on the back of a major Iranian-sponsored popular mobilization unit militia. In addition, they have expanded 4 Syrian air bases. Debka File military sources report that Russian diplomats are meeting with heads of the Iranian-backed PMU at secret venues in Moscow, Syria, and Iraq. The PMU, which is under the command of General Qasem Soleimani, head of the Al-Quds arm of the Revolutionary Guards, is a coalition of Iraqi Shiite militias. These talks aim to develop a new base outside Syria for launching Russian military intervention in the Middle East. They also plan to offset the American-Syrian border defense forces, which secure the borders, held by the Syrian Democratic Forces. The U.S. is attempting to hold back invasions by Turkey, Russia, and Iran. In response, Moscow is using Iran's PMU as a way to gain a proactive role in Iraq, but also in Syria, where the Iraqi Shiites are being deployed on behalf of the 2 allies, Russia and Iran. Last Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said that American troops would remain in Syria after ISIS is defeated in order to ensure that Iran and Syrian President Bashar Assad would not take over the areas that have been liberated with U.S. assistance. The former Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, as well as leaders of the PMU, have visited Moscow twice over the past 3 weeks. They are intent on circumventing a U.S.-Saudi plan to install a government in Baghdad that is not oriented on Iranian influence. They also plan to secure the collaboration between Moscow and the PMU. Russian officers are being assimilated for the first time by the PMU command center just south of Iraq, where they have begun synchronizing their bilateral operations. But the main issue now is the start of Russian arms supplies to the Shiite militia group. The Russian military was making its first comeback to Iraq after a 15-year absence since the U.S. 2003 invasion. In addition, Moscow and Tehran were also anticipating a development in Baghdad. Prime Minister al-Abadi, instead of meeting with the Saudi-backed Iraqi Shiite clerk, Muqtada al-Sadr, announced that he had signed an agreement with the PMU head, Hadi al-Amiri, in order to establish the Iraqi Victory Coalition. Al-Abadi explained, quote, "The coalition will work for all Iraqis and through relying on national talent, strengthen the unity of the country and national sovereignty, and achieve justice and equality among Iraqis in rights and duties." But then al-Abadi appeared to backtrack. He said he trusted that the PMU representatives he had accepted for his coalition were not members of the PMU militia, but, quote, "politicians who volunteered to fight, and now their relationship with the PMU has ended." Al-Abadi said he would be ready to work with the PMU after the elections. This left the door open to the deal against Tehran, brokered by the U.S. and Riyadh. One consequence of these steps is the creation of a new Iraqi Shiite rapid deployment force for countering the 30,000-member Syrian border guard army that Americans are forming in northern Syria. This force would be based mainly on the Kurdish YPG militia. It will have a new air combat arm attached to the units deployed to Syria, which they named the Combat Helicopters Directorates. This will be the first time that a Shiite militia fighting in the Middle East will have its own helicopter unit, which will allow the Iraqi militia to operate independently and relieve Moscow of having to get involved in military operations. This strategy is causing concern in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. The Iraqi militia will be able to conduct low-altitude strikes over the Syrian and Iraqi borders. The U.S. still has an important option for countering Russia's reach into Iraq and overshadowing its alliance with Iran, to announce that the Trump administration has decided to retain American bases in Iraq, as well as in Syria. This would draw a line against Russian and Iranian military control, spilling over from the south into the regions north of Baghdad. As a result, the Trump administration may restore its relationship with the Kurds in northern Iraq. 4 months ago, the U.S. abandoned them when the PMU militia coalition defeated the Kurdish Peshmerga army and overran the Kirkuk region. The chain of America's Iraqi bases links up with its bases in northeastern Syria as a continuum, based mainly on Kurds on both sides of the border.
Our diplomatic efforts will be characterized by stabilization initiatives and a new emphasis on the political solution to the Syrian conflict. But let us be clear. The United States will maintain a military presence in Syria, focused on ensuring ISIS cannot reemerge. Our military mission in Syria will remain conditions-based. We cannot make the same mistakes that were made in 2011 when a premature departure from Iraq.
Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi had this to say about mending relations with the Kurds.
بالنسبة للعلاقة مع الإقليم تعرفون فعلنا منذ فترة اللجان المشتركة لنقاش كل المسائل العالقة اللي هي تشمل الحدود، منافذ حدودية، مطارات، النفط، دفع رواتب وإنهاء كل المشاكل العالقة.
Wathiq al-Hashimi, head of the Iraqi Group for Strategic Studies, who claims that the situation has stabilized after last year's war, had this to say.
كان هناك عمليات إطلاق هاونات ومدفعية في كل يوم على كركوك وعلى منطقة طوس خرماتهم اللي قدمت خسائر كبيرة وتهديم للبنى التحتية. كان هناك طلب أن الحكومة الاتحادية ترسل قوة لهذا الأمر، أرسلت قوة وبدأت عملية تطهير للأوكار التي تطلق هذه الإطلاقات على المنطقة.
Meanwhile, the Russians are in a race for bases in Syria. On December 24th, Russian Defense Minister General Sergei Shoigu announced the start of working to upgrade the bases in Tartus and Khmeimim. He said, quote, "We have started the process of formation of our permanent force in Syria." Debka military and intelligence sources have learned that they were not just working on upgrading the 2 existing sites in western Syria, but also taking over and expanding 4 additional Syrian Air Force bases. This may explain why no Syrian Air Force jets have taken to the skies for operations over the past month. The Tiaz military air base, also known as T4, located west of Palmyra, is the largest in Syria. The Russians are massively converting it into their main center of aerial operations in central Syria. TS will also provide backup as needed for Khmeimim, which recently came under drone, missile, and mortar attack. In addition, Palmyra Airport provides air support for operations in eastern Syria, including the Deir ez-Zor province. Moscow has agreed to hand it over to Iran. The Revolutionary Guard's Al-Quds chief, General Qasem Soleimani, is planning to make Palmyra the main assembly center for the new pro-Iranian Iraqi Shiite militias to be deployed from southern Iraq to Syria. Their presence at the Hama military airport will enable the Russians to exercise control from central Syria and the highways to Damascus from the north and the center. The airport's location is only 125 kilometers from Russia's Tartus naval base on the Mediterranean coast. If the naval base comes under attack, air support would be available in a short amount of time. Shirat, the Syrian Air Force's 50th Air Brigade's base, is located at Horns. It has 2 runways and 40 shelters, which serve as the main gate of entry for Russian and Iranian air transports, landing each day to deliver supplies of weapons and spare parts for military systems and vehicles. Debka military sources report that the Russian armed forces have designated 6,000 officers at the 4 renovated bases in Syria, most of them Air Force and Special Operations personnel. Some have already arrived. This new layer faces the military bases that Moscow has taken possession of in western, central, and eastern Syria. They face the chain of military locations the Americans have decided to keep in northern Syria. Russia and the U.S. are now in a race for bases in Syria, and both are in the process of dividing a large portion of Syria between them. Whoever takes over the reins of government in Damascus will be left with just half of Syrian territory under their rule. Debka sources reveal that Turkish troops have stepped up their offensive against the Syrian Kurdish militia. They attempted to enter Afrin and were pushed back by the militia. Over 100 targets were hit by Turkish jets and artillery, and reports indicate there are civilian casualties. For the first time in Syrian civil war, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad instructed his army to allow Kurdish reinforcements to pass through the main road from Hasaka and the Aleppo region in order to help the Kurdish militia in Afrin against a possible Turkish invasion. Turkey Prime Minister Binali Yildirim claimed the objective of Operation Olive Branch was to establish a 30-kilometer security barrier inside Afrin to protect Turkish towns from attacks. He had this to say about the airstrikes.
Alanın yumuşatılması faaliyetleri halen devam etmektedir. Ayrıca yarın itibariyle gelişmelere göre kara unsurlarımızda gerekli faaliyetleri icra edecektir.
Turkish Defense Minister Nurettin Kanikli had this to say in Ankara.
Bu harekat yapılacak. Terör örgütleri oradan temizlenecek. Diğerleri detaydır. Diğerleri gelişmelere göre arazinin olgunlaştırıldıktan sonraki atılacak olan adımlardır. Onun zamanı en uygun zaman seçilmeye çalışılıyor.
An itibariyle
o her an olabilir, yarın olabilir, akşam olabilir. Esasında fiili olarak da hareket başlamış durumda esasında. Yani bugün değil. Esasında işte biliyorsunuz yani sınır geçmek hariç onun dışında Türkiye'ye yönelik o tacizleri ortadan kaldırmak için
yapılan atışlarla operasyon zaten başladı diyorsunuz.
Yani, o yönde söylenebilir, evet.
The Turkish army has several obstacles to face before it can move into Afrin. The U.S. forces based in the Syrian city of Manjib are about 120 kilometers from Afrin. Erdogan included Manjib in his threats, stating the following.
Batıdan başlayarak kademe kademe bu koridoru da yerine yeksan edeceğiz. Afrin operasyonu sahada fiilen başlamıştır. Bunu Münbiş takip edecek. Madem ki Münbiş'te bize verilen sözler şu ana kadar yerine getirilmedi, öyleyse bunun gereğini yapmamıza kimsenin söyleyecek bir sözü olamaz. Ardından da kademe kademe Irak sınırına kadar ülkemizi kuşatmaya çalışan bu terör pisliğini temizleyeceğiz.
The Syrian government condemned the strikes, calling the attacks, quote, brutal Turkish aggression on Afrin. They threatened to shoot down any Turkish jets flying over Syria. Russia controls the airspace over Afrin, so this may stop Ankara from using its air force there. Kurdish forces from northern Syria could face the Turkish army with trained Kurdish fighters armed with U.S. weapons. ISIS and Syrian rebels could potentially use this feud to take over lost territory from the Kurdish fighters in northern and eastern Syria. In a Facebook post, Russia's foreign ministry said that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson have been discussing plans to restore stability to the region. Last Tuesday, Debka sources revealed that the U.S. had supplied the YPG with portable anti-air missiles to prepare for possible Turkish airstrikes. According to the Turkish military, the strikes on the Syrian Kurdish YPG militia hit 108 targets, and Turkey-backed Syrian army rebels were helping the operation in Afrin. So far, the strikes have killed 6 civilians and 3 fighters. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has discovered that Trump's plan to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital was part of a broader agenda created with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the UAE ruler Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. Abbas was faced with the dilemma of how to explain to the Palestinians that his 25-year-old plan to force a pro-Palestinian solution on Israel had failed. Trump's plan, which is based on a two-state solution, no longer abides by the pre-1967 borders, which Abbas had previously claimed was an essential condition. It would create a Palestinian state governed by the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria and would be made up of Palestinian towns from Nablus in the north to Hebron in the south. It would also include the Gaza Strip and parts of northern Sinai, as well as Ramallah and Abu Dis. The government would be based mainly in the south, so Jerusalem would no longer be relevant as its capital. On Sunday, Abbas addressed the PLO and lambasted Trump, who turned around and cut funding to the UN Works and Relief Agency for Palestinian refugees from $165 million to $60 million. His plan to cut funds has been in sync with the Saudis, Emirates, and Qatar, who have already been cutting funds to the Palestinian Authority over the past few weeks.
المفاوضات السياسية برعاية دولية وليست منفردة. أوضح؟ لا نقبل أمريكا أن تكون وسيطا بيننا وبين إسرائيل.
With us in the studio to discuss these issues is Dr. Martin Sherman, founder and CEO of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me back.
Do you think the Turks and Erdogan will expand the Afrin operation to a major offensive in northern Syria against the Kurds?
I think that the only thing that will prevent that is some credible counter threat. And probably the only source of such a counter threat is the US. Now, I think this incident, the ongoing incident in northern Syria is very enlightening with regard to a number of issues. First of all, the divergence of interests between the state actors active in Syria. The Turks are strong supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Iran and Syria are strong opponents. So you have an emerging quagmire where you might find strong adversaries between adversarial relations between the state actors there. The second thing is the double standards between the world's attitude towards the Kurds and the Palestinians. The world seems to be completely apathetic towards the Kurds' aspiration for independence, but very sympathetic towards the Palestinians. And the third thing is, if the United States really does step in to curtail the Turkish action, what is going to happen within NATO? You're going to have two NATO members confronting each other in a very tense situation, and this, I think, highlights the problematics of Turkey as a NATO member.
Moving now to U.S. Vice President Pence, do you believe that he is accomplishing what he set out to do on his Middle East trip?
Well, I think in many ways it's a bit early to say that, but I think certainly he has been clear about bringing across that there's a new sheriff in town. And the things that were happening under the Obama regime and the apologetic anti-colonialist attitude of the previous administration are no longer in play. And this administration has an unapologetic pro-Western attitude towards the Middle East as well. So I think that this is an important message that's been conveyed. I think the best that he can hope for in the Arab countries is reluctant resignation. In Israel, of course, he'll find very little resistance to this message.
How do you think it will be possible to continue working towards a peace plan with the Palestinian Authority avoiding any negotiations with the U.S.?
Well, I have rather radical views on this. I think that the peace process has been a sham for a quarter of a decade. And this is a good time to seize the moment and expose the deceitful sham and hoax that it is, and look for a different formula to resolve the issue, which do not really involve the Land for Peace formula, which has proved a disaster and brought about the death and the maiming of thousands of people since it was first instituted.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Now to a roundup of this week's regional stories you may have missed, the news in brief. Researchers at the University College London have found a way to uncover the ancient secrets of Egypt by developing a new multispectral imaging technique. These image sensors are able to capture data at specific wavelengths across the electromagnetic spectrum. The writing on masks and coffins, over 2,000 years old, is often concealed by the thick paste and plaster that holds them together. The researchers claim that this technique will allow artifacts to be preserved through the analyzation process, which typically is destructive to the artifacts. Now that a 35-year ban on cinema was lifted, Saudi Arabia is finally screening films. This weekend, dozens of Saudi families were able to enjoy animated children's films in the state-run Cultural Hall in Jeddah, which has a projector, a red carpet, and a popcorn machine. The first permanent theaters will open in March. Cinemas were banned in the early 80s under Islamic pressure to discourage public entertainment. There are now plans to open 300 cinema theaters with 2,000 screens by the year 2030, which could pump $24 billion into the economy and create 30,000 jobs. That's it for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Thanks for watching.